In this next set of lectures on the brain, we're going to look primarily at the cerebrum. So we'll look first at the structure of the cerebrum, and then we'll look in this first little video at deep cerebral structures. And then we'll look at the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layering of the cerebrum, and all the areas that are found there. And then we'll talk a bit about brain waves and EEG and how brain waves are measured, and then how that's related to sleep and sleep rhythms. And then finally, we'll discuss the cranial nerves. So the largest and most obvious part of the brain is the cerebrum. We discussed already in the previous videos the brainstem and the diencephalon, so we can think of the cerebrum as sitting on top of the diencephalon. This is really the seat of our higher cognitive activity, specifically the cerebral cortex, which is again the outermost layer of the cerebrum. It's only a couple of millimeters thick. Really, it's about 6 cell layers deep. And that is where about 75% of all the neuronal cell bodies in the nervous system reside, is in the cortex, the outer layer of the cerebrum. We divide the cerebrum into two hemispheres there's a big fissure in the middle of the brain, and this is called the longitudinal fissure. And that splits the cerebrum into two hemispheres. The left hemisphere, which controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere, which controls the left side of the body. So the left hemisphere is where the motor impulses that regulate the right side of the body muscles, and then the vice versa on the right. All the sensory information from the right side of the body, especially conscious sensory information, is coming up and it's mapped into the left hemisphere and vice versa. The two hemispheres are connected via a band of fibers called the corpus callosum. And you can kind of see that down here in this coronal section, we can see down here, you see the outermost layer is the cerebral cortex, and this is mostly composed of gray matter. And the gray matter itself is where, remember, neuron cell bodies are found, as well as associated glial cells. So this is the gray matter, and then underneath that is white matter, which are the tracks of the neurons going to and fro. So we have neuronal cell bodies here, and they send projections down. It's going to go down into the brainstem and so forth. Just to orient you on this particular picture, on this coronal section, this is of course the first and second ventricle. Here is the third ventricle, and then here is the thalamus on either side, and then right below that would be the hypothalamus, and pituitary would hang there. And then not shown here, they kind of have it in cross section, but this would be where the brainstem is. So the diencephalon, of course, is all in here, and then the midbrain here, and then the pons going downward. So again, we can think of it as sitting on top. So we have gray matter on the outside, white matter on the inside. There is an area of gray matter deep within the cortex. Deep within the cerebrum, and this is known as the basal ganglia. So you can see that here. And we'll talk about that next. The basal ganglia will be super important for regulating voluntary or motion that you call up that you want to do, regulating that kind of motion, so posture and muscle activity and so forth. So that's the basal ganglia. Going back up here, if you look at the sort of surface of the cerebrum, it's folded into ridges, and these are called gyri, and then there are furrows, and those are called sulci. So gyri and sulci are the ridges and furrows, and we can divide the cortex into 4 distinct lobes. So we'll look at those. But the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe over here in green, and they're all distinctly separated by different sulci or gyri, so we can see a separation there. We have a temporal lobe here, and then the occipital lobe here. Deep within the temporal lobe, there's actually a 5th lobe called the insula, but you have to peel away the temporal lobe to see the insula. So underneath all the cerebral cortex would be the white matter. And again, we'll look at subcortical structures very deep down in the cerebrum, such as the hippocampus, the basal ganglia, olfactory bulb, and something called the limbic system coming up here. All right, so that's a basic overview of the cerebrum. Remember, the cerebrum is covered in dura. Well, it's covered in meninges, and the outermost layer is the dura. And the dura has there's something called the false cerebri, which is an extension of the dura down into the longitudinal fissure. So that's shown in this picture here. and that's going to go all the way, that's going to go very deep down, and that's again going to separate the right and the left hemisphere. And then within the dura are these venous sinuses, and remember that's where all the cerebral spinal fluid, but all of the blood from the brain is draining into, and that'll drain back into the internal jugular vein. So that's a little overview of the cerebrum. Now let's go and start at the base of the cerebrum, and let's look down at the deep cerebral structures. So the first structures we encounter here are known as the basal ganglia or basal nuclei. Remember, a nucleus is a collection of nerve cell bodies. So these are areas where there are a bunch of neuronal cell bodies. And this area is extremely important. It's actually interconnected with the cerebral cortex, with the thalamus, and with the brainstem. And we'll look at its functions here in just a minute, but let's look at some of the parts of the basal ganglia. So it can get a little complicated because you have to think sort of three-dimensionally, and I don't have it here, but there are a number of good videos on YouTube and other places where more three-dimensional representations are given in video, and so that might be helpful to look at if you are confused about these different structures. But the first thing to notice is, if we zoom in over here, is an area of something called the striatum. And the striatum is really made up of several parts. So that's this whole structure, maybe I'll draw it in blue here, this whole structure here, this is the striatum. There is a dorsal part, and then there's a ventral part underneath here. So the striatum is really composed of, if we're going back here, the dorsal striatum is composed of what's called the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So the caudate is actually the part that's looping above here. So this is the caudate nucleus here. And then the putamen is this round area here. And so that's part of what's called the dorsal striatum. The ventral striatum is composed of something called the nucleus accumbens and the olfactory tubercle. And that is not shown here. It's actually deep, it's down in this region here. So maybe they'll show you a different picture here in just a minute. So that's the ventral striatum. And then there's the globus pallidus, which is actually sandwiched inside the putamen. So bear with me here, but if you look at the coronal section down here, I'll draw that in red. Here you see so here's going to be the midbrain down here. Here's the thalamus, and here's the first and second ventricle, and here's the third ventricle, and the hypothalamus is right down here with the pituitary. And then if you look at this cross section, you see the putamen here. And again, we have to think three-dimensionally. That's actually this area on this picture up here. That's going to be this purple area here. And then right inside is the globus pallidus. And there is an external portion closest to the putamen and an internal portion that's furthest away from the putamen. Now, just to make things a little more confusing, sometimes the putamen and the globus pallidus together are known as the lentiform or lenticular nucleus. So that's the lentiform or lenticular nucleus. And so coming off of that would be the caudate nucleus. And again, in this picture up here, that's coming around the top. And we see a little portion of the caudate down here in the coronal section as well that's been cut off. All right, so that's the striatum, and then the globus pallidus. We also have, as part of the basal ganglia, the substantia nigra, which we already talked about in the midbrain. So these are midbrain structures, and these are super important because here there are neuron cell bodies, and they're going to send projections up into the striatum, and they secrete dopamine. So these are dopaminergic neurons, and as we'll see, again, the basal ganglia, and I'm going to review the functions here in a moment, but one of the main ones is to regulate voluntary movement. And so when you get a loss of these dopaminergic neurons, which happens in Parkinson's disease, we see the characteristic kind of movement changes in Parkinson's. The really stiff movements, the resting tremor, all of those are all due to loss of those dopaminergic neurons from the substantia nigra. So that's one condition that can result from pathology there. There are also nuclei associated with the thalamus. These are the subthalamic nuclei. And so that's pictured here. So those are actually just below, as you would think, the thalamus. So those are subthalamic nuclei. So all of these, the striatum with the caudate and the putamen, and the globus pallidus with internal external substantia nigra, the subthalamic nuclei, nucleus accumbens and olfactory tubercle. These are all the structures of the basal ganglia. So it gets a little complicated, and again, this is all three-dimensional. But there's one final structure that's important to know, and that is coming down from the cortex. We have these neurons up here, let's say motor neurons, and we'll look at that shortly. They project their axons down, and they all go down. They're going to go into the brainstem via this pathway. So they're going to pass between the thalamus and the caudate and the putamen. So they're going to pass in between them. And this is called the internal capsule. So the internal capsule is super important because it is really where all the ascending and descending fibers going to and fro the cerebral cortex are going to pass. And so one way to think about the basal ganglia is that they're going to receive inputs from the cerebral cortex, motor inputs. They're going to process those inputs and then output it to the brainstem. So think of the basal ganglia as kind of a motor processing center to help with, as I mentioned before, specifically voluntary movements. This diagram might help a little bit, but this shows some of the connections within the basal ganglia. So there are different pathways, for example, coming down from the motor cortex, and they synapse onto the striatum. And then here is the globus pallidus externa and interna. And then here is the subthalamic nucleus. Here's the substantia nigra. Here's the thalamus. So I'm not going to go through all these pathways. You don't need to memorize them. But just think that the motor impulses are coming down. They're going to undergo processing. Some input will go back to the cortex to regulate that motor activity, and then we'll have output down to the brainstem. And that's going to go down to the spinal cord, and then that's going to go out your motor neurons to your muscles. So again, a motor processing area. Finally, this little picture to the right is just another representation of what we saw. But again, shows you pretty clearly the putamen with the globus pallidus on the inside. And here's the caudate wrapping over, so it's got a head, body, and tail. At the end of the caudate, which actually is not part of the basal ganglia, but it's going to be part of something called the limbic system, is a little area called the amygdala. And the amygdala means almond, they're little almond-shaped structures, is going to be very important in emotional responses, especially fear and anxiety and so forth. Okay, so that's the basic kind of structures involved in the basal ganglia. Now, what are the functions of the basal ganglia? Again, I mentioned to control voluntary movements, and there's two pathways that are used for this, something called the direct and something called the indirect pathway. For our purposes, we don't need to go into details on that. I do, down here in this little picture, you can see some of the pathways. It's complex in the basal ganglia in that a number of different neurotransmitters are used. So if you look, for example, at the cortex, it uses glutamate, and those glutaminergic neurons now come down into the striatum, and they're going to interact with neurons there. And then there are different pathways. Again, there is a direct pathway, and this actually uses GABA, and then that's going to influence the globus pallidus, the internal globus pallidus, and that will influence the thalamus, and then there's going to be more neurons that send information back to the cortex. So that's one pathway. There's another pathway that uses, again, GABA down here from the striatum, and it works with the subthalamic nuclei, and that feeds back to the globus pallidus, internal globus pallidus, and then to the thalamus, etc. So again, that's very complicated, and I'm not going to have you memorize all that. But importantly, you see in the blue, from the substantia nigra, dopaminergic neurons that project up. And they have either a stimulatory or an inhibitory role, and there's different receptors they work on. But what's very important is that the substantia nigra is very influenced by disorders of dopamine. So when the substantia nigra, those neurons start to fail and they stop secreting the dopamine, all sorts of movement disorders happen. Can also get behavioral disorders. So specifically Tourette's, and obsessive compulsive disorder, and then different addictions we think are related to this dopaminergic pathway in the basal ganglia. Addictions are more complex. There's another pathway called the ventral tegmental area pathway that also is involved. And then movement disorders. So we usually think of basal ganglia associated with Parkinson's, and that's really loss, as I mentioned, of the dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra. Huntington's disease, which is another movement disorder characterized by chorea, sort of unwanted movements, disorders of gait, posture, difficulty with speaking. There's also dementia that begins to occur with Huntington's. And this has to do with lesions to the GABAergic neurons in the caudate and the putamen. And then in the subthalamic area, lesions there can result in a specific type of chorea. Chorea is a type of movement disorder with flailing, sort of ballistic, undesired movements, and this is called hemiballismus. So hemiballismus, specific type of chorea, again, chorea is a movement disorder, has flailing, ballistic, undesired movements is kind of its clinical picture. So that's a little bit on the basal ganglia. We can spend a long time talking about that, but we'll touch upon it again when we look at Parkinson's and Huntington's disease and in the neurology section. But that gives you a little overview. So this is the first set of deep cortical structures. Now this is going to be tied in with the limbic system. So we're going to see there's also roles of the basal ganglia related to cognition and emotion, as well as eye movements and then procedural and habit learning. But again, we typically think of it related to the movement activity. So the limbic system, zooming out a little bit from the basal ganglia, but involving some of the components of the basal ganglia, is the next deep cortical structure. And this is also known as the paleomammalian cortex. And that was going back to Paul MacLean's idea that this was part of the old mammalian brain that sat on top of the R complex, the reptilian complex. We know that in addition to mammals, that birds have a very well-developed limbic system, so this is not exactly accurate, but it can be thought of as the next sort of area of development above the brainstem in the midbrain. So what are the different components? There's the limbic lobe, and you can think of that as sort of an additional, almost like a sixth lobe of the cerebrum. It's actually the rim of the cerebral cortex on the medial side of each hemisphere, so going on the inside. So one of the big components, and you see that in green to the right here, is the cingulate gyrus. So that's going to sit right on top, actually, the corpus callosum. Remember, the corpus callosum is the white fibers connecting the right and the left hemispheres. So the cingulate gyrus sits on top of that. There is the parahippocampal gyrus, and that is just below the temporal lobe, and that's depicted here. And then the hippocampus, which is, in this particular picture, it's in the purple. So it's a big structure here. And again, it's hard in the sagittal view to get an appreciation of that. This is really a three-dimensional structure. Then there's the dentate gyrus between the hippocampus and the parahippocampus, parahippocampal gyrus. The amygdala, as I mentioned, which is at the tail of the caudate nucleus. And that is, so they call it the amygdaloid body right here. The septal nuclei, this is an area beneath the corpus callosum. Mammillary bodies, which are part, actually, some people categorize it as part of the hypothalamus. We discussed that a little bit in the section on the hypothalamus. And then the thalamic nuclei, which are just next to the thalamus, sometimes again categorized as part of the thalamus. And then olfactory bulbs. And then there's different tracts of myelinated axons. So it gets complicated, and again, there's no need to memorize all of these different structures, but know that these are deep cortical structures. They're highly interconnected, and their main function is related to what we might call the emotional brain. So in the neurophysiologic view, emotions begin from this area. Now, there's some interesting evidence that this area is receiving sensory input from different organs in the body. So your lungs, your heart, and so forth. So it could be, and this goes back to another idea I've discussed in class a bit, and that is that the emotional body is really not centered in the brain. It's centered in your organs of breathing and circulation. But then the brain senses the activity in the heart and the lungs, registers that activity in the limbic area, and then conveys that to the cortex, and we become conscious of the emotions and so forth. A good example of that is the amygdala. We think the amygdala is involved in fear and aggression, also, anxiety. And in traditional medicines like Chinese medicine, fear is often associated with the kidneys. Well, interestingly, if you sort of map holographically the entire human being on this picture of the brain, and we'd really have to do that with the coronal section, which I don't have shown here. But if you do that, the amygdala would actually correlate with the area where the kidneys would be found. So there's sort of a morphological relationship there, at least just superimposing those kind of images. But again, there's some evidence that there are nerve pathways connecting the kidney system with the amygdala. So this, I think, is an area we might see a lot more research developing around, showing that, really emotions we might think of feelings is beginning in the body. And then the brain registers that and it becomes conscious. So we might think of the emotion itself as in the body, and then the feeling is our conscious perception of that. We think the limbic system is involved in pain and pleasure, aggressive behavior or docility, affection, anger, rage, sexual arousal. So all of these emotional responses that we have, we think are centered in the neurophysiologic view in the limbic system. Also highly tied in with olfaction. So this is the one cranial nerve number one, that really is not connected with in addition to the optic nerve, those two are not connected with the brainstem. And so olfactory information is delivered directly to the limbic system. And that's why scents and all of that are often emotionally triggering because they have direct access to this limbic area. And this area is also involved in memory and learning. So it cooperates with the cerebral cortex, especially the front of the cortex called the prefrontal cortex, in memory and learning behavior. And then damage to this limbic area results in severe memory impairment. And the hippocampus is that area in the brain where we essentially take short-term memories and consolidate them into long-term memories. So this is thought to be kind of our emotional processing center, the hippocampus. So again, this could be a whole subset of lectures on all these different structures, but at this point we just want to get an overview and understand that the limbic system is considered to be part of that emotional brain, involved in many of these different emotional responses. It's tied in with the hypothalamus and pituitary, and so there's a direct connection with the endocrine system as well as the autonomic nervous system. So very strongly integrated with the rest of the body here. So that's the limbic system, and that's the last of the deep cortical structures we'll look at here. In the next little video, we'll look at the cerebral cortex itself.